want to thank Father Brian for giving me that cheery gospel to preach on. I also want to begin today by recognizing that my mom is here this morning, sitting with Ginny and sitting with my kids, Jack and Abby. Our family... Now when I tell you why, you're going to feel really dumb that you just clapped. Because it was 30 years ago this week that my youngest sister Jennifer died suddenly. And so although we are not really celebrating, just like happy times, birthdays, holidays, those sorts of things, we think it is appropriate to mark this unhappy anniversary together. But enough about my family. Let's go back to the readings. As we heard in today's gospel and in our first reading from the book of Numbers, when it comes to doing the work of God, sometimes the issue is not whether we should do God's work. Instead, in both readings, there's this question that deals with who is qualified to do the work of God, who has the right to do God's work. In the gospel, John goes and tells Jesus that someone has been driving out demons in the name of Jesus, even though that person does not hang out with the other disciples. And in the first reading, these two guys named Eldad and Medad start prophesying, even though they had not gone to the official gathering where some of the people had received this spirit that allowed them to prophesy. In both cases, these folks seem to be doing good things, but the objection is that they are not part of the group, not us. Now, I don't know about you, but in both stories, I sense this sort of, Mom, Dad, you know who is touching my food again, kind of tattletale thing going on. The stories raise that question about who can do the work of God. In the first reading, Joshua, and in the gospel, John, both seem to have a problem accepting certain people doing God's work because in their minds, those people are other. Joshua and John seem to get hung up on the lines that divide us from them. And they seem to believe that unless you're one of us, you must be one of them, and thus certainly not authorized to do the work of God. However, Moses and Jesus seem to respond differently than the tattletales had been expecting. Moses says, "Are you jealous for my sake?" And Jesus says, "No one who performs a mighty deed in my name can at the same time speak ill of me." To me, those responses suggest that God does not consider the supposed outsiders to be them. God only seems to see us, all of us, them included. I think that's kind of important to remember just a few weeks before an election. Because if we support one candidate, it's possible that we may view the supporters of another candidate as them. And that can mean any number of things. We might think those people are dumb or even evil, but whatever we might think, we think they are them. So if you're Eldad or Medad, can you still prophesy even if you didn't go to the official meeting? Well, for me, the answer, like many answers in the life of faith, is, well, it depends. Let me give you an example of what I mean by asking a question. Is it wrong to steal a loaf of bread? Well, if you've ever seen or read Les Miserables, then I think you can see why I would argue that sometimes circumstances matter almost as much as actions. If I'm just seeing whether I can get away with stealing that loaf of bread to feed someone or to throw out the window, well, that's different than trying to help someone who's hungry and not having the means to do so, like Jean Valjean did. Remember that the villain in that story is the policeman, Inspector Javert. A man so sure of what was right and what was wrong, who was good and who was bad, who was us and who was them, that he became obsessed with catching the bread thief. Now, I would argue that Javert went wrong in the story, and Joshua and John went wrong in today's readings, and many of us go wrong in our daily lives when we confuse the action with the actor. In Les Miserables, Valjean did something that, at least on its face, was bad. But the problem arises when someone like the inspector decides that because he did a bad thing, he must be a bad person. We really need to be careful before we connect those dots. But us and them thinking can lead us down that road. I once attended a parish mission conducted by some Redemptorist priests, and one night they spoke about sin and forgiveness, and the priest who preached that evening talked about the need to remember that there are no bad people. His argument was that because all of us are made in God's image, we are by definition good, everyone, without exception. Now, that does not mean that we good people never do bad things, but this priest maintained that we need to separate the person who is good from the action, which may be good or bad. But since the beginning of time, some of us good people have done very bad things. But while we may have done something bad, we're not bad people. That's an important distinction. But it's a distinction I don't hear most of us make very often. I don't want to single anybody out, but I hear law enforcement folks talk about protecting us from the bad guys, them. I hear on the news about bad actors taking advantage of good people. You know, like the folks who call you on the telephone and they want money to be paid in gift cards. I mean, they're doing something bad. But when we call them bad actors or bad guys or bad anything, we're making them into the other, into someone who is not one of us. That's what I mean by us and them thinking. And it's a type of thinking that is just so prevalent in our country today and in our world and even in our church. But it's certainly not new for people to divide the world into us and them. It's there in a gospel story from 2,000 years ago, and in that first reading from Moses and the Israelites in the desert 1,000 years before that. But I believe that Jesus wants us to know that although we people are free to make bad choices and do bad things, we are not bad people. Just as Joshua and John believed certain folks didn't have the right to prophesy or to drive out demons, we moderns tend to draw lines around our group, reinforcing the idea that those of us inside of those lines are somehow different, maybe even somehow better than those outside of the lines we draw. I believe, however, that if we spend any time with today's readings, they just might tell us that when we make someone into the other and put someone outside of those lines we draw, everyone ends up on the wrong track. We miss out on an opportunity, the opportunity to widen the lines of that circle around us until those lines eventually disappear. Now, Scripture frequently points out the problems that result from othering. In all four Gospels, for example, we read about Jesus' various dealings with Samaritans, a group of others who were hated by the good Jews of Jesus' day. When I read those stories, I often think of myself as being so much more evolved than the people of the time of Jesus, but then I wonder, am I? Really? So I want to try a quick thought experiment here. What if we replace the word Samaritan with some other word? What if that famous parable was called the good telemarketer? The good baseball umpire? What about the good NRA lobbyist or the good undocumented immigrant? Or would you, for example, enjoy a parable called the good Chicago Cubs fan? Now go ahead, substitute your own example. See how far you've come from the Samaritan-hating people of Jesus' time. I suspect it may be that many of us still have a ways to go. In today's readings, Jesus and Moses both seem to say that if you want to be on the team, you're welcome to be on the team. In fact, you already are on the team. Everyone is one of us. Do we disagree with people? Absolutely. Do some people do bad things? You betcha. But one of the bad things we do involves thinking of other people as being other. Whether they're of a different race, from a different country, practice their religion differently, have a different sexual orientation, or root for a different baseball team. And when we make someone into the other, we not only will object to that person doing God's work the way John and Joshua objected, but we'll miss an opportunity to help create the sort of community that God seems to desire for us. As the Jesuit priest, Father Greg Boyle, says of his work with gang members in Los Angeles, we imagine with God a circle of compassion, and then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle. And we move ourselves closer to the margins so that eventually the margins themselves will be erased. For me, a big step toward creating that circle of compassion involves catching myself and trying to work on my phrasing whenever I hear the word us or the word them coming out of my mouth. If there really is only us, then I think we need to be kind to each other, whether we agree on everything or not. One of the ways to create that circle of compassion and erase those lines that divide us from them is to be friendly. There's lots of other work we can do too, obviously, but on this retreat that we did shortly before my class of deacons got ordained, the priest running things gave this advice about being a successful deacon. He said, "Try not to be a jerk." I think that's good for everyone to hear, not just deacons. Maybe mostly deacons, but... And I actually do try sometimes without success to be nice. Not enough, but sometimes. Maybe something as small as smiling at a stranger as I walk past, because, if today was 30 years ago this week, and you walked past me and smiled, you wouldn't have known that my sister had just died. But your smile would have lightened my load and welcomed me into your circle of compassion, where I could feel included in the midst of the pain that I was going through in those days, that my family was going through those days, to make us feel less like one of them. And you never know. That young man you run into across the street on campus may just have gone through a breakup. Or the young woman you meet in the parking lot may have gotten bad news about a relative. Or an older person in the grocery store may have heard of the death of a friend or a family member. We all carry stuff around with us that no one can see. Stuff that can separate us from others just as easily as us and them thinking can. But I think we can make things a little better if we just try to be kind, because no matter what we carry, no matter where we're from, no matter what we have done, we remain part of us. I suspect there really is no them, not in God's eyes anyway.